Thank you. Thank you all for being here at this amazing conference, especially those of you who are returning and those of you who are first-timers. This is absolutely just a spectacular conference. More for many, many more years. My name is Gustavo Aurellano. I am the editor of the OC Weekly, and I spoke last year about my book, Taco USA, How Mexican Food Conquered America, which was for sale, but apparently it's sold out. So thank you all for selling it out, and I'll sign it. Next year we have to buy more copies so it could sell out even more so. I love this conference, not just because of the topics that we're talking about, not just because we get to hear from amazing people doing amazing things with food, but on a personal note, because any excuse I have to come to New Mexico, I take it immediately. I've been coming now to New Mexico probably at least once a year since 2007, and my wife and I, we've been staying a couple of days usually in Albuquerque, but also moving up a little bit to Santa Fe and Chimayo now for the past 5 years. On our way back, we take this long road trip all the way to the south to do this humongous yard sale, and then we come back and speed, to the safety of Albuquerque for that. And this past time around, I picked up a copy of New Mexico magazine, not the most recent one, but one from a couple of months ago. And this was just this past August. And when Steve gave me this daunting topic, Mexican foods, quote unquote, dialogue with indigenous cuisine, it seems a little bit tough to try to pull together, but in reading New Mexico magazine, specifically one article, I finally figured out how to put it all together, and it was and what triggered it for me was the mutual enemy of Mexicans and the indigenous folks, the Spanish. So what happened was, in the back, I guess the New Mexico magazine has like blasts from the past, some articles from 30 years ago, 40 years ago, or whatever. So there was an article, I think it was written in the 50s. Am I too loud? I'm always very loud. Sorry. I get excited too, so I get even louder than that. Actually, probably don't even need this, but we'll do it. The article was written by a priest, and he was talking about, it was just an excerpt. I would have loved to have read the whole thing, but essentially he was talking about New Mexico and its heritage, and specifically the cultural traditions of New Mexico with food. And he was insisting what, unfortunately, I hear way too often, that the cuisine of New Mexico has nothing to do with Mexicans. It's all the Spanish, and it's all the Indian, the Pueblo folks here, but has nothing to do with Mexico whatsoever. In other words, New Mexico has nothing to do with Mexico, period. Never mind, of course, that a lot of the initial people came from my home state of Zacatecas, which last I checked was in Mexico. Never mind that everyone here is eating these amazing chilies and tortillas, which one way or another came from Mexico, whether it was with, before Columbus came in or with the colonists. And never mind the fact that New Mexico has this very interesting word called Mexico in it. And part of me, of course, just especially from the Chicano studies side, we always, hem and haw about, Hispanos this and Hispanos that. But finally, it struck me, it was like a bolt of lightning. I realized why this particular priest, and why also just sometimes people who have this issue with the Mexican influence on New Mexico. I finally realized what their problem was, and it's the indigenous part of Mexico. And this actually, if you take the bigger perspective of why there has been so much anti-Mexican hatred, over basically as long as there's been a United States and Mexico, it's always been that indigenous part. It's the idea that in Mexicans, obviously a Mexican is a mestizo, part Spanish, part Indian, but the problem that people always have is the Indian part, that the indigenous part never went away, that despite centuries of the Spanish and then the Americans and then the English trying to eradicate that influence of the indigenous never went away. So the way I see Mexican food, our dialogue, if you will, with indigenous cuisine isn't so much a dialogue as we are a spokesperson on a grand scale for the ultimate triumph of the old ways, of our traditions of indigenous cuisine. Because you see that with Mexican food on a worldwide scale. I know it's hard to envision when you go to Taco Bell and think of anything indigenous there, or you see this humongous chipotle brick of 7 pounds of beans and rice and all wrapped up being eaten by a hipster. But there is, within there though, if you pay attention, you can hear millennia of traditions talking, despite all this corporate veneer. You hear millennia of it. Every time you go to a Mexican restaurant and see people wrapping up, putting food into tortillas, you're hearing the ancients speaking to us. You're hearing in your beans, in your chiles, in all these different cuisines, you're hearing the ultimate triumph of the indigenous folks, not just from the Southwest, but really from all of Latin America. And the way I see it is that there's been 3 stages of how this cuisine, our cuisines, has been able to talk really to the rest of the world. There's like 3 eras. You'll have the era of appropriation, the era of what I just thought of this one up, the era of revenge, and then finally the era of what's slowly starting to come up, which is, I think, the realization from the world that these ways that people try to eradicate and ridicule for centuries, frankly, are the right ways. I mean, I was at the Santa Fe Farmers Market this morning and just seeing, and even here, seeing all these vendors with anasazi beans and the blue corn, and there was a tea that I just bought from the Dene people. I can't remember the name of it, but we had a little taste of it. It was amazing. You're seeing that toward the end. I'm jumping up ahead. So in my book, Taco USA, obviously it talks about, everything you could possibly want to know about burritos and tacos and tequilas, blah, 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 blah. It's all in there. But I made sure that the first chapter specifically dealt with the foods that obviously through the prism of Mexico, but if you want on a larger scale, the Americas gave to the rest of the world. If you think of world cuisine, it really is indigenous cuisine. When you go to Italy and you're having pasta, the tomato came from the Americas. When you go to India or anywhere where there's a hot stuff, all those peppers first came from the Americas. And almost always it came through Mexico, just because Mexico was the first big part of the New World conquered. And from there you had the Spanish galleons going back to Europe, going westbound to Manila, and spreading all these different foods. So obviously where certain foods, the provenance of certain foods will be debated forever. And it seems every year it keeps going further and further south to like South America. So I just read an article that chilies, actually, the original chilies came from like Colombia, that part of South America. Same thing with corn, like the ancestor of corn. Like you always hear these different topics. But in my book then, I talked specifically about two of the most important foods, or at least sweets, I would say, known to the world, which is, of course, chocolate and vanilla. Those are the 2 things that people can specifically trace to Mexico, especially vanilla, especially the process of pollinating the vanilla pod. That came with the Indians of the coast of Mexico, right there in the Gulf, the Totonacos, the Totonacs. They were the people who, when they came, unfortunately for posterity's sake, they were the first tribe to make friends with Cortez, just because they hated the Aztecs so much, and of course it came to bite them in the end. But one of the secrets that the Totonacs refused to give to the Spaniards was how to manually pollinate these vanilla vines. Eventually, and it not until the 1800s would someone finally be able to discover how on earth did the Totonacos pollinate these vanilla vines into making them to the pots. But you have chocolate, of course, became a worldwide phenomenon. You have vanilla. You have corn, of course. Once they started coming up to the Southwest, corn was already ubiquitous here. But all these foods start spreading across the globe. All these foods start transforming the cuisines of these particular regions. I mean, to the point where you lead to what I would say is the second part of the indigenous the indigenous dialogue of food, which is, I know it's kind of cheesy to say, but it's revenge, really. So what have we had now when we think of these big products? What do we think about when we think of chocolate? Nothing but disgusting sugar. It's poisoning our children. It's destroying, populations worldwide. Corn, beautiful, wonderful corn. What did the rest of the world do with it? Corn syrup. Feeding it to our animals and, essentially making us fatter and fatter and fatter. Same thing with all these other different products, because what happened was in appropriating our cuisine, no one ever really bothered to talk to us saying, okay, how exactly should we eat this? How exactly should we do it in a way that's going to be sustainable? No one ever did. So as a result, you have seen, you've seen what's happened with all these different foods. On the other hand, you also have what I think is one of the greatest, meals really known to mankind, which is the humble tortilla. You have a tortilla, and obviously now it's spreading it's always been a part of the United States basically, but it's spreading all across the world. You have tortillerias now in Japan, in China, in Europe. I have a friend whose friend is a millionaire. She became a millionaire running a tortilleria in Belgium, of all places. And I think with that tortilla, obviously you haven't mechanized, a lot of them are mechanized now, and even let's disregard just for a little bit the whole issue of GMO and corn and all that. But the tortilla fundamentally has not changed for 7,000 years, ever since tortillas have been made. How do you make tortillas? You get corn, you do the magic process of nixtamalación, you make your masa, you pat it out, right there is a tortilla. So every time you have a college student eating a taco, whether it's fried, after you make the tortilla, that's a whole other story, whether you fry it or whether you make it in tortilla chips, whether you make it in tortilla chips or enchiladas, you're eating there something that has not changed. That to me is a triumph. So much food is always, and evolution's good. Evolution's wonderful. All this evolving and all that, but I would argue very few foodstuffs can have as long of a history as the tortilla does. And I think that is an amazing triumph for indigenous folks. And what you're now having with the popularity of Mexican food is that people are also realizing that there is more to Mexican food, really, than what we've been eating, these combo plates and even these regional meals. The high-end chefs in Mexico and here, they're really taking a page from what happened in the Southwestern cuisine movement of the 1980s, and they're going back to the future. So it's not just good enough that you have the tortilla. It's not just good enough that you have these indigenous products like nopales, cactus, you have squash blossoms. Today we had huitlacoche. Only Mexicans could possibly love corn fungus, and we love it with a passion. I think that's something powerful to say. But what you're now seeing also is these chefs going back and really taking foods that even in Mexico have not been appreciated because they ended up just relegated to indigenous folks, to the tribes in Mexico that are still there. Because also in Mexico, of course, there's always been a campaign of shaming any sort of what's the saying? Mexicans love dead Indians, but hate living Indians. So we'll idealize Cuauhtemoc and all the Aztecs and the mines and the pyramids, but then you see a huichol walking down the street and you're going to cross the street, the huicholes being the tribe of Zacatecas. But now you're seeing chefs speaking to that dialogue or speaking to that particular cuisine. You're seeing chefs now using ant larva being a very, very, it's almost, think of it as Mexican caviar if you want. Very juicy, very delicious. Again, relegated for centuries to just the tribes, the last Nahuatl-speaking tribes of central Mexico. Now it's being used. You're seeing the one that really strikes me. Earlier we had a lecturer talk about pulque. Pulque, the Spaniards, one of the first things they tried to do was get rid of pulque. Because pulque, I'm not a fan of pulque. The most charitable description I could give it is like drinking milky spit. Yeah, at room temperature, hey, that's it. But what's amazing is that pulque now, it's a hipster drink. Hipsters, young Mexicans, and increasingly young Americans who are going to Mexico City because it's increasingly hip, they're drinking this pulque. There's now a rise in pulquerias. They were almost eradicated by the 1800s by the Spaniards and then by the Mexicans who said, don't drink this. This is a dirty Indian drink. And now, triumphant, the pulque is coming back. It's absolutely amazing thing. And the best example I could give to you about how, in Mexico especially, the indigenous cuisine has triumphed is with the Saga of Oaxacan cuisine. Now, I'm sure a lot of you know about Oaxacan cuisine really quickly. Oaxaca is one of the southernmost states in Mexico. In Mexico, it has always been just demonized and ridiculed because a lot of folks in Oaxaca, they're still indigenous. For a lot of them, Spanish is their second language, and they speak, you have different language groups. You have Zapotecos and Mixtecos and all that. So for centuries, just demonized and what have you. So in Mexico, Oaxaca, you have Oaxacan cuisine, which if you've ever had it, it's an amazing, one of the best foods in the world. It's not just me saying it, it's, Martha Stewart and, all the great chefs around the world that you have pilgrimages of people coming to Oaxaca. Well, historically in Mexico, Oaxacan food was just dismissed as nothing. Everything changed. Finally, Oaxacan food got its day in the sun, not in Mexico, but in the United States. And then really briefly, if you've never had Oaxacan food, It's known as the land of the seven moles, and of course we know mole being this very rich stew from Mexico, kind of like a curry. You have different types of moles. And so in Oaxaca, you have seven moles. You have your green, and your yellow, and your red, and chocolate, and onward and onward and onward. But a lot of the stuff that you use in Oaxacan food has not changed for centuries, if not millennia. So there they still eat dried chapulines, grasshoppers. You dry them, if you've ever had dried shrimp, it's exactly like that. Crunchy, briny, salty. Maybe not everyone's cup of tea, but hey, it's a good bar appetizer. You have humongous tlayudas. So in Mexico, you have, of course, corn tortillas, flour tortillas, and then the third tortilla is a tlayuda, like about this big, very thin. That has been the Oaxacan way of making tortillas. So in the 1980s, you finally started to get Oaxacan immigrants coming up into the United States, specifically in Southern California. So a lot of these Oaxacans, because of that stigma that they had in Mexico, they refused to live alongside other Mexicans. So they didn't move to the traditional Mexican immigrant landing areas in Southern California, of like East Los Angeles, the city of Santa Ana in Orange County. They mostly lived in the west side, the rich area of Los Angeles. There they were living with the people who were hiring them. And these Oaxacans, they were working as nannies, as gardeners, as line chefs, as lavaplatos, dishwashers, and onward and onward. And of course, when you have a bunch of immigrants coming to a particular region, they're going to bring food. One of the first businesses immigrant populations bring with them, along with religion, is food, because they want that. As we know, food immediately communicates culture. So eventually, one of these Oaxacans, a man by the name of Fernando Lopez, he decides to open up a restaurant, a Oaxacan restaurant, the first one ever in the United States in 1994, called Guelaguetza. Guelaguetza is the name of this. It's like what? Dia de los Muertos mixed with Woodstock, mixed with Coachella. I mean, it's this week-long, if not month-long festival where all these different groups and villages, they come down to a specific stadium in Oaxaca, and they have their songs, they have their dances, they have their foods. I've never been, but apparently it's one of the most beautiful things you'll ever see. So, Guelaguetza. So he opens up his restaurant, and the full story is in my book, but he told me, and he's now, I'll get to that point actually. Fernando Lopez opens up his restaurant in Koreatown, and so he says that when he first opened, the only people who would come to his restaurant would be Oaxacans and rich people from the west side, because you had all these Oaxacans going to their bosses and saying, hey, look, try this food, try this tamal de mole negro. So tamales wrapped in banana leaves with basically chocolate mole inside. Try this, try that. And then eventually they said, come to this restaurant where you could have the food of my homeland. So, Guelaguetza, the original Guelaguetza, was in a rougher part of Koreatown. So Fernando, he would say, when he first opened it, he would be bewildered as, you have this stream of Oaxacans. Okay, that makes sense. But then you would have this line of Audis and BMWs and Mercedes-Benz coming in. He couldn't figure it out. And then finally he realized it. White people were not going, non-rich Anglos from the west side were not going to Guelaguetza at first because they didn't know what Oaxacan food was. They had no idea of it at all. And crucially, other Mexicans were not going in to Guelaguetza because for them it was dirty Indian food, pinche indio food. That's what it was for them. But eventually, of course, since Oaxacan food is so amazing, Oaxacan food quickly became a foodie obsession. By 1994, Guelaguetza was covered in the New York Times magazine. New York Times, the food section, came out obviously in the Los Angeles Times, came out on national media. The Today Show made a big segment of it, came out of Martha Stewart. It became an internationally famous restaurant within a year because Anglos got it. For them, Oaxacan food wasn't Indian food. For them, it was just Mexican food. And more importantly, it was just delicious food. There was no prejudice against it. And very tellingly, that didn't happen initially with the Mexicans. Very tellingly, La Opinión, which is the largest Spanish language newspaper in the country, one of the oldest, going back about 70, at this point, 80 years, they would not review Guelaguetza until 1998. Because for them, Oaxacan food, why should we cover it? That's not Mexican food. That's not alta cocina. That's not high-end Mexican food. It's just pinche indio food. It's just Indian food. And of course now, flash forward 20 years later, Guelaguetza is an institution in Southern California, caters to all the big Hollywood studios, all, basically anyone who loves Mexican food has an audience of, everyone now. Everyone knows what Oaxacan food is. When you talk about the world's great cuisines, Oaxacan food just jumps over Mexican food, period, because it is that amazing. And Fernando Lopez, God bless his soul, he got rich off of it, retired to Oaxaca, and now he operates a hamburger stand of all things. Yeah, go figure that one out. But I think, and I think that's just such a telling metaphor, especially for those of you who are, in the pueblos and are raising your traditions that go back thousands of years, hundreds of years. I think that there's something telling in that your food, ultimately our food, will rise triumphant, especially in this day and age where people want to know where their food comes from. People want to know the history of it. We are no longer content with having our cattle, eating in a feedlot and being just brutalized their entire life. We want them to be grazing. If you missed out the awesome panel beforehand on just like the livestock of this area, your corriente cattle and then your churro sheep, I think that really is the future. People want to get back to that. You see that, especially in Southern California, you see that in urban gardening or anywhere. Like people want to grow their food. So basically people are turning to indigenous folks. People are turning to Mexicans really to see how do we heal ourselves from this, basically a century really, if you will, of rampant consumerism when it comes to our cuisine, our food, which has left us to the way we are. How do we go back to the old ways? Who do we talk to? What do we grow? And on my own personal behalf, growing up, as Mexicans, you always, or as Mexican Americans to be specific, you're kind of embarrassed of the old ways of specifically, the matrilineal side from your mom's side. Oh, take this herb. Oh, your stomach hurts? Let me boil some herbs that I have from my garden. Oh, you have like this ache, put this poultice on you to make it happen. As a kid, you're like, why do we need this? Let's go to the doctor, let's go take some pills. Let's go do this and that. Of course, we all know it as homeopathic medicine or whatever. These are tried and true traditions that have been going back thousands of years. And especially, unfortunately, the way our healthcare system in this country is so royally effed up, I think more and more people are realizing that. Even in the Mexican culture, we would dismiss the people who had that knowledge as curanderos, witch doctors, basically. That's the Catholic Church telling us that the Indian ways are the wrong ways. The great example, of course, we have in New Mexico literature is Bless Mi Ultima, of course, where you have this whole story of Ultima, this, curandera that comes from a long line. She knows the ways. Her ways are ultimately the right ways because they are in communication with whatever you want to call it, whether Mother Earth or, frankly, rationality or, frankly, the best ways to get to that certain way. So for all of you, really, learn that lesson from Mexican cuisine. Learn that there is resistance. Learn that there is there's survival, and learn that there ultimately is going to be triumph as long as we keep to those old ways, as long as we give the old ways the respect that they deserve. And ultimately, in the food stuff, when you eat that food, it's amazing. The lunch that we had yesterday, the tamales and the blue corn gruel and all of that, you give it to anyone, and if they're not going to immediately want to eat that style of food, sustainable and delicious for the rest of their lives, then frankly, they are deservedly screwed. So thank you so much, folks. I really do appreciate it. We can talk later on. I'll be around. Thank you. Oh, yeah.